The power of communication. Next, we will discuss the importance of communication and what it might look like for individuals with the most significant needs. Self-determination is important for all people, including individuals with significant intellectual disabilities. Let's take a moment to read the points in this slide. Every person wants to make choices and have some form of control over their life. Students with significant intellectual disabilities will have no self-determination if not taught to communicate choices. Individuals who cannot make or communicate choices will have all decisions made for them. Explicit instruction in choice making and communication is critical in order to support and protect the integrity of individuals with significant intellectual disabilities. Students need to be taught to generalize across settings in making choices about their living, recreational activities, and vocational options. Involvement in a variety of settings with a variety of experiences will allow people with significant disabilities a basis on which to make choices. If you've never been to the zoo, what would you base your decision to go there on? If you've never had chocolate ice cream, how would you know if you would want it? A consistent form of interpreting students' wants and preferences is important for all people who will communicate with students throughout their life. It often requires a multidisciplinary team to determine the most appropriate form of communication for an individual and ongoing coordination to guarantee that all caregivers are offering the same opportunities and recognizing responses in the same way. Before we even begin with communication training and before a child enters school, caregivers have been watching and interpreting signs that a child is uncomfortable or happy, or that they like or dislike something. Routines have been established that the child may have learned to predict. These are critical communications that need to be built on and shaped to be more comprehensive. For teaching a volitional communication system, the student's educational team should consider 3 critical points to begin. Number 1, how will choices be presented to a student? 2, how will the student indicate a selection? And 3, how will we motivate the student to participate? Choices can be presented as real objects or representations of the objects, including visual or auditory cues. Real objects are often the most successful way to begin, such as having a child touch or otherwise select yogurt for more yogurt. A representative object, such as a spoon for yogurt, can be generalized for eat. Visuals can vary from colorful, close to reality pictures to black and white icons. In most cases, the more realistic the pictures, the less interpretation is needed. The student's mode of selecting a choice will depend on physical abilities. They can vary from pointing to or picking up a choice, use of switches, eye gaze, or any physical movement that is determined the student can independently make. A student with significant intellectual disabilities is almost always offered a highly preferred item to request in the beginning. As their skills develop, discriminators will be introduced, and it is hoped that a student will eventually be able to make a selection from a variety of preferred and non-preferred options. Students with significant disabilities have a small repertoire of communicative responses that serve multiple functions. For example, crying may be used to express frustration, discomfort, need or want, or exhaustion. Whether or not it's intentional, many behaviors that are perceived as problem behaviors should be viewed as communicating by those who care for the student. Envision this scenario. A student is fed spinach and spits it out. Each time spinach is put in his mouth, he repeats spitting it out. He may not have intended to communicate, "I don't like spinach," but that message is certainly understood after repeated trials. The student may also learn an important communication mode. Spitting out food results in removal of food. Replacement behaviors should be identified for problem behaviors and taught systematically. Replacement behaviors should be functionally equivalent to the problem behavior. Examples of communication modes include, but are not limited to, the following: use of pictures, objects, high-tech devices, gestures, facial expression, change in posture or muscle tone, vocalizations, and eye gaze. It is most important to remember that none of these modes of communication provide automatic understanding to an individual with complex needs. There is a teaching protocol that should be followed for introducing or interpreting each one of these. Eye gaze, as an example, will be presented. Many students use a multimodal communication approach, such as pictures paired with vocalizations. Each student with complex needs will have individual strengths and challenges. It's critical for team members to collaborate to determine the most effective response mode for each student. Trial and error should be the standard, as there are no guarantees of which mode will be most effective for any particular student. The team must be conscious that as a child grows and learns, these response modes may change as well. Some examples of response modes include change of facial expression or body tension, cries or laughter, eye gaze, vocalizations, sign language, picture or object representation, and verbal communication. A team of professionals should work together through a transdisciplinary approach in determining the most functional mode of communication for an individual. These team members could include a physical therapist, occupational therapist, speech therapist, vision or hearing teachers, special education teacher, paraprofessionals, general education teachers, family or home caregivers, the individual or student, the school psychologist, and medical personnel such as a doctor or nurse. Some or all of the above mentioned may have input on identifying the best possible response mode for a student with complex needs. Sometimes the school psychologist who evaluated a student may not be thought of as a contributor, or the medical personnel who can offer input about medications or possible procedures that will impact a choice of response mode for a student. How do we interpret student responses? Once the response mode has been determined, practice and reinforce it in an adaptive setting and consider the following. Have the student's need been met? When using eye gaze, pointing, touching a switch, etc. to select a food item, does he or she consume it? When the student indicates that he or she wants a desired item, do they play with it? Is the response consistent even when the answer choices are in a different order or location? Data should be collected regularly on student choices to ensure responses are accurate and intentional. Once the response mode has been practiced successfully in an adaptive setting, generalize that to a more functional setting. When a student has learned to request a food item in the classroom, for example, use that skill and those materials to allow him to make selections in the cafeteria. When a student has been successful asking for a preferred item or activity during practice sessions, build that choice making into a schedule of reinforcement. Let's look at eye gaze as a sample communication instruction. The first step in teaching eye gaze as a mode to communicate is to determine if the student can track a highly preferred item. When using a highly preferred item for tracking, the student can be immediately reinforced. Other considerations. Some students will behaviorally resist. Consider the following. Number 1, is eye gaze the best communication option? If not, what has the transdisciplinary team considered, such as a change in respiration, crying, a finger movement, etc.? 2, is the reinforcer sufficiently preferred? 3, does the student have access to the reinforcer under other circumstances impacting the student's interest or satiation? Sample communication instruction, eye gaze, step 2. Once tracking capability has been established, place the highly preferred item where the student is already looking and immediately reinforce with taste of or use of the item. Gradually move the item into positions where the student has to adjust eye gaze. Be conscious of limited head movement for students. Use repeated trials to present the item and move to different areas within the student's visual field. Example: ask, "What do you want?" while holding the item in the student's visual field. If the student looks to the item, immediately provide access to the item, reinforcing the student's response. Instruction should begin with one preferred item. Item discrimination should be introduced after consistency of tracking one item has been established. When presenting more than one item, be sure that the target item and distractor are sufficiently apart from one another so that it is obvious where the student is looking. Additional considerations for eye gaze include the following. The discriminator can be a non-preferred item or an item that is significantly different from the preferred item dimensions. Keep choice items within the parameters of the field of vision previously established. Consider background options. Will the background be clear or high contrast color? Will items be placed vertically or horizontally? Include items that are appropriate in size based on the student's visual abilities. Objects should have significantly different tactile qualities. If using objects due to low vision or cortical vision blindness, allow for tactile cueing. Allow sufficient wait time, considering the student's ability to visually focus. Data should guide the selection of materials and progression throughout the process. Let's discuss error correction procedures for students who use eye gaze to respond to instruction. If the student makes an incorrect response, ignore the response and remove the incorrect response or item from the student's visual field. Allow a brief pause and repeat the request or directive while prompting the student to the correct response. Immediately reinforce the student's correct response with use of or taste of the item paired with descriptive verbal praise, such as, "Great job, you chose ball." Remove items from the visual field and present again in a rearranged order. This is an example of using time delay procedures to teach students using eye gaze as a response mode. Additional considerations. Do not deliver the attentional cue or verbal request more than once per item presentation. Limit visual and verbal distractions. Regarding step 6, removing items from visual field and presenting again in a rearranged order, some students may be prompted through a familiar established activity, such as clapping, raising hands, touching body parts, smiling, etc. So be conscious to reinforce only the desired response. Take a moment and view the following video clip.
For Ethan, yes or no? Good, you looked at yes. Yes, you can recycle newspapers.
Were you able to interpret the student's response? Did the student turn or adjust his head toward the answer? What prerequisite skills would you want to know in regards to this student? You would need to have already established that this student was able to make a concrete selection that was clearly distinguishable. You would need to have established that the student recognized the meaning of yes, and that by choosing it, he was opting for the selection. You would have to have established that the student as readily selects yes as no, and have correspondence checks to demonstrate that skill. Remember that yes and no responses are fairly sophisticated and that they require a more complex level of understanding questions and answers, as well as have the ability to generalize from one skill to the next. Providing access to communication. Watch the video clip about Ellen. Imagine what Ellen's team needed to know about her in order to devise her communication system. If she didn't have access to her augmentative alternative communication device, can you imagine what the assumptions would be about her and her abilities? Only a couple of decades ago, there was not access to AAC devices as there are today. How different the outcomes are for students with complex needs who have a creative and dedicated team and access to AAC.